Hi, John Hess from FilmmakerIQ.com, and today we'll explore the history of the credit sequence. When Auguste and Louis Lumiere first turned on their motion picture machine in the Grand Café in Paris of 1895, there were no credits nor titles. The film just began. The same was true with the early films of Georges Méliès. Here, the 1897 film After the Ball just begins. No title card, no credit, and why would we need them to get in the way of seeing Jeanne d'Alcy undress? Well, it wasn't until 1900 do we get a peep of what might actually be the first title card of all time. In a cleverly titled comedy, How It Feels to Be Run Over, which is really just a film of one of those newfangled horseless carriages driving recklessly and running into the camera. And then we get some quick frames reading, "Oh, mother will be pleased." I guess you had to be there. A year later, in 1901, we start seeing intertitles. Now, these are title cards in the film itself to provide dialogue or to set the scene. Perhaps the first use of intertitles comes from the British film Scrooge, or Marley's Ghost, which is also the first time the Holiday Dickens classic was adapted for the silver screen. At the same time, we start to see the beginnings of title cards at the front of films, and even copyright and anti-piracy warnings with Thomas Edison's 1902 film Trapeze Disrobing Act. Here, a stern warning from Edison himself, ironic given the amount of pirating and exhibiting foreign films he may have been responsible for. Now, this one also happens to be another one of those titillizing silent film stripteases, only done on a trapeze, by uncredited vaudeville strongwoman star Laverie Valliere, better known as Harmion. By the time The Great Train Robbery, what many consider the first feature film, came out in December of 1903, the practice of putting title cards at the beginning of the film was becoming commonplace. Also notice the practice of placing the trademark of the producing company. But one thing you won't see in the title sequence of the earliest films is the name of the actors in the film. That is all about control. Thomas Edison, borrowing from his experience from the phonograph, tried to monopolize the early film industry. Part of that is making sure that the actors and the directors wouldn't be able to get a big popular following and then demand higher wages. And most other film producers followed suit, or at least they were forced to. Early film stars were known under their character names. Mary Pickford was Little Mary, and Florence Lawrence was the Biograph Girl. But the star system, which came from theater, was really pervasive. By 1909, when publicity stories about silent film stars' personal lives began to go to press, the cat was sticking his head out of the bag. In 1910, Carl Laemmle lured silent film star Florence Lawrence away from Biograph and their parent company, Edison's Motion Picture Patent Company, to work for his studio, IMP, Independent Moving Pictures Company. He floated a fake report that Lawrence, using her real name in public for the first time, was killed by a streetcar in New York City. Then he mounted a huge ad campaign, proclaiming that report as a smear, a black lie run by Edison to ruin Lawrence's career after she left Biograph. And if you needed proof, you just had to come down to the theater to see leading man King Baggett escort her to the fabulous premiere of their first picture together, The Broken Oath, presented by IMP. Well, the publicity stunt worked. It was a media blitz as fans, thrilled that she was still alive, rushed her and tore off pieces of her clothing. Lawrence became a household name, and by 1911, other studios would start promoting films on their star power. Eventually, even Biograph would join in, promoting their star director, D.W. Griffith. Here in Griffith's first feature and last film before going independent, Judith of Bethulia, in 1914. We see Griffith's name appear after a title card for credits to Biograph. But in Griffith's next film, Birth of a Nation, he let everyone know exactly who was in charge. The title card sees his name or initials in 5 different spots. Each intertitle also contains Griffith's name. Now, these title cards were all basically static, probably created by just shooting a printed board or a painted glass. But there were some experiments in animating titles. The first experimental animation from 1906, Humorous Phases of Funny Faces, gotta love those early 20th century film titles, was animated by J. Stuart Blackton using chalk and stop-motion animation. Into the 20s, we have some early animated title sequences from Europe, where film was more of an artisanal product than the factory mentality of Hollywood. Here with Lotte Redinger's The Adventures of Prince Ahmed in 1926, and even the very first released silent film by Alfred Hitchcock from 1927, The Lodger, a story of the London fog. Into the 20s, the major Hollywood studios began to employ full-time lettering designers for creating titles and intertitles. The first Academy Awards, held in 1929, even handed out a statue for Best Title Writing that went to Joseph Farnham for no film in particular. But that was the first and last year the Academy would give out the award for title card design, as sound had shaken up the industry and decapitated silent film the year before. With sound came the overture, a musical introduction that set the mood and allowed latecomers to settle into their seats. Under the Hollywood studio system of the 30s and 40s, this musical title sequence stayed pretty consistent, but studio artists working on painted glass would experiment with different kinds of typography to evoke different moods. Still, studio films stuck to a familiar template. A film would always begin with a studio logo. Then the top billing stars would get a above the title credit, followed of course by the title. Then the rest of the cast is credited, followed by the screenplay credit, cinematography, music, wardrobe, and finally the director, though it's not necessarily always in that order. Only key department heads were given credits in the film, even if they really didn't do that much. If you worked at a studio as a craftsperson, you were an employee of the studio, basically a skilled factory worker, and not necessarily of any one particular film. So credit really isn't all that necessary. Some movies would add a quick end title card that just lists the names of the cast. A famous example is Wizard of Oz from 1939, which ends on this list of the cast. But everything was really based on the producer's discretion. In the studio system, titles was just done by another department in the studio. Directors may have had some say in the style, but like the marketing of the film, it was just something that another part of the movie making factory was responsible for. So titles wouldn't really begin to evolve until after the collapse of the studio system, and individual producers and directors became more artistically involved with the entire film, including the marketing, which is why you see a growth in creative trailers around the same time. The collapse of the studio system started in the 50s, would coincide with the rise and growth of another pop culture American art medium, advertising. The economic boom in America after World War II saw a great demand for graphic design in both advertising and packaging. A demand that was filled in large part by European design schools, specifically the German Bauhaus school, which contributed to that mid-century modern look in both design and architecture, and the International Typography style, or Swiss style, a graphic design discipline that emphasized heavily on minimalism, typography, and grids. Everyone's favorite sans serif font, Helvetica, originates from the Swiss style. Now, out of this advertising discipline would come the name that anyone watching this video with any bit of familiarity with title design is expecting me to cover: Saul Bass. Trained in the new Bauhaus and Swiss styles in the art schools of Brooklyn, New York, Bass moved out to Hollywood in the late 1940s to work on movie posters. This 1949 poster for Champion shows Bass combining the American realism with the Swiss style emphasis on typography. Now, after a string of posters, director Otto Preminger gave Bass his first title sequence assignment, Carmen Jones. Condensing the modernized Bizet opera into a single moving image, that of a flaming red rose, was really quite revolutionary for its time. But it was his next title sequence Bass would do for Preminger that would be seen as the breakthrough in modern title design. The Man with the Golden Arm catapulted Saul Bass into title sequence legendary status. His career continued working for Billy Wilder in The 7-Year Itch, and retelling the entire story in animation for the end credits for Michael Anderson's Around the World in 80 Days. But Bass is perhaps best remembered for his work for Alfred Hitchcock, who, as we already seen, has an affinity toward unique title sequences. And Hitchcock, after all, started his career as a title designer. These films include Vertigo, North by Northwest, and of course, Psycho. But Saul Bass wasn't just stuck to kinetic typography. He saw the title sequence as essentially a moving poster for the film itself, boiling down the ideas and concepts of the show into a brief few minutes of film. A philosophy of his was to make the ordinary extraordinary, which can be seen in Walk on the Wild Side, which tells a grandiose tale about an ordinary cat prowling the streets of night like the Lion King. We could devote a whole episode to Saul Bass, and there are many online who do that, but he wasn't the only title designer on the scene. Maurice Binder is the title designer responsible for creating perhaps the best-known character intro of all time, the James Bond gun sight sequence from 1962's Dr. No. Binder ended up shooting the sequence through a pinhole camera looking down the barrel of a .38 caliber gun. The barrel gets washed over with blood before becoming part of a dancing circle sequence that is very in line with the Swiss style. Binder would work on every Bond film except To Russia with Love and Goldfinger up till his death in 1991. He was succeeded by Daniel Kleinman, who worked on every Bond film since GoldenEye, with the exception of Quantum of Solace. Pablo Ferro is another big name worth including in our short tour of 1960s title design. Ferro rose to prominence creating the first color NBC Peacock animation. His hand lettering graces the beginning sequence of Kubrick's Dr. Strangelove, and he combined multiple split screens in a complex woven montage for the original Thomas Crown Affair. Ferro would be responsible for over 100 title sequences over his lengthy and distinguished career. Bass, Binder, and Ferro were just three prominent figures pushing the artistic boundaries of just what a title sequence could do. But not all directors wanted title sequences, and with studios gone, the number of people who wanted their name in the credits grew longer. Well, the credits had to find a new home. With the studio system replaced by a producer-based system where each film is its own company with its own employees, getting a screen credit became more and more important. If you were a set designer, having your name in that title scrawl of the film was undeniable proof that you actually worked on that film. It's also key for smaller jobs as well as they work up their resumes. The first film to get an extensive end credit but skip opening credits altogether were the aforementioned Around the World in 80 Days from 1956 and West Side Story in 1961, which also tapped the talents of Saul Bass. Now that everyone on a movie set was basically a freelancer, craft guilds began to gain power in the 60s and 70s, and contracts began to stipulate who and what was required in both the beginning and end credits. Now we'll get into what all those jobs and those end credit sequences mean in a future lesson. An interesting example of the legal battles involving credits occurred over Star Wars: The Empire Strikes Back. The Directors Guild of America stipulates that the director be the last name of an opening credit sequence. Well, Star Wars doesn't have an opening credit sequence. We just get studio logos, which include that Lucasfilm logo, and then we're into that famous title scroll. With A New Hope, Lucas was both the writer and the director, so the DGA was fine with that Lucasfilm logo and no opening credit for the director. But Lucas didn't direct or write Empire. Irvin Kershner directed, and screenplay credits go to Lee Brackett and Lawrence Kasdan. The DGA and WGA saw the Lucasfilm logo at the beginning as a credit without giving recognition to the real director and writer, and threatened to pull Empire out of theaters. Well, Lucas settled their dispute by paying a $250,000 fine out of his own pocket and then promptly dropped out of the DGA, the WGA, and the MPA for good measure. But I think the DGA has a strong case. Ask most non-film geeks today who directed The Empire Strikes Back, and most people will incorrectly name George Lucas. Now, to most of those same people, the end credits aren't really more than a formality with some pleasant music. Unless you're going to a film festival, 90% of the audience is gone by the time you get to the craft services credit. Knowing this, some filmmakers began putting little bonus treats at the end of the credit called the post-credit scene. One of the earliest examples of this post-credit scene cited for starting the trend is 1979's Muppet Movie, which runs the credits over footage of the Muppets hanging around at the theater and the ending with Animal saying, "Go home! Go home! Bye-bye." In 1980, Airplane ended the credits with a callback to an earlier taxicab joke. Throughout the 80s, the post-credit scene was commonplace in a lot of comedies, often entertaining the audience during the credit sequences with outtakes, or in the case of Jackie Chan films, stunts that went horribly wrong. And of course, how can we not mention Ferris Bueller's Day Off?
You're still here? It's over. Go home. Go.
But the post-credit scene takes on more meaning in a heavy franchise film, starting with 007's ubiquitous line, "James Bond will return in such and such movie," which wasn't always accurate. And now with the Marvel Cinematic Universe stretching out to infinity and beyond, I know, but they're both Disney, the post-credit scene has become some pretty serious geek fodder, a last-minute tease to get people talking on their way out about the next film. I cannot understate how game-changing digital has become for the title sequence designer. The original Saul Bass titles were meticulously done by hand. The bars in Psycho were actually 6-foot-long aluminum bars painted black that had to be moved carefully with a camera overhead recording stop-motion animation. Although technically you could say the spirals created by Bass in Vertigo were the first use of a computer in a title sequence, that computer being an anti-aircraft targeting computer. The first real use of computers in the construction of titles is often credited to the title sequence for Superman in 1978. Using a computerized Oxbury animation camera, they're able to create the streaking effects using the same long exposure concept that 2001 used for the Stargate sequence. But it really wasn't until the 1990s, with non-linear editing and digital compositing, that you really see big artistic leaps in title sequences. Kyle Cooper is one big standout name, known for his work with David Fincher in Seven in 1995. But there are a lot of really talented artists working in the arena of title design. With the second golden age of television starting in the 2000s that brought compelling storylines and beautiful production value, the title design has a new outlet. The Sopranos, Dexter, Mad Men are just three of the much heralded title sequences burned forever in the minds of these shows' fans. From a few simple printed cards to the lavishly beautiful digital pieces, the title design has been witness to the power struggles of Hollywood before eventually transforming into a living, breathing art form that can put us in the right mood for what we're about to see and even get us to take a break at the end of an exhilarating film. So, consider titles as an element of making something great. I'm John Hess. I'll see you at filmmakeriq.com. You still here? It's over. Go watch a cat video.